So I want to start out first by thanking you all for having me here. It's quite a privilege, and it's actually a bit of an occasion because almost exactly 10 years ago, I was giving my defense at this exact same seminar. So it's nice to be back for that bit of a milestone. So I got my PhD here back in 2009. And I then kind of did a 180 and went off into the private sector to do transportation consulting. But one thing that's kind of stayed with me is an understanding of how to approach problems that I learned from all the great faculty here at Berkeley. And I think that's really helped me in how I've progressed in my career, both how I approach the job, but also how I interact with other people. I enjoy teaching as well, so as was introduced, I haven't had a chance to come back and share with the students here, and that's been really a highlight of my time here. So with that, I will get to my topic, which is transportation safety, which is a little ironic because when I was doing my dissertation here, I was all about operations, and I pretty much never touched anything having to do with safety, despite literally sitting next to Offer Grumbeck, who is, the co-director of SafeTrack, and his entire dissertation was about safety. So he was always talking about safety, and I was like, that's great. But then I graduated, got a job, and it's actually been one of the core things that I've done over the past 8 years. And it's allowed me to recognize really how critical a topic it is, how it really affects everyone using transportation, and allowed to put my sort of impact on it. So I'm going to share some of the insights I've had, some things I've learned from some recent experiences and recent projects. So now I do recognize that many of you have very little concept of what's involved in transportation safety. So I'm going to spend the first part of my talk really just giving an introduction, the type of data we look at, some of the projects that are involved in transportation safety, kind of get us all on the same page. Before I dig a little bit deeper into some of the state funding sources and some of the insights I've gained from working with those programs. Finishing off with really the consultant perspective. I know it's a strange and mysterious perspective from an academic setting, but hopefully I can add some of that, since many, I think, of you are master's students and will probably be joining that world. Finally, finishing off with a case study, a great client that I've worked with recently and had great success with. So, safety data. What is safety data? Well, almost all safety data originates from crash reports. It's CHP, it's local police, arrive on the site of a crash and kind of have to do a little bit of narrative building and deconstruction of what happened. Safety data is one of those weird things where you can't anticipate it. You can't decide to go out and collect safety data and then go to a field visit or go experience a crash, because they all have happened in the past, at least hopefully for most of us. So a lot of safety data is diagnosing. It's trying to figure out what information is contained. And of course, the more data we have, the better picture of a location we might have. Now, the incident reports get taken from a narrative into essentially a spreadsheet. That's how I get it anyway, which has things like the date and time, location, what the environmental conditions are, the severity, what were the injuries involved in the crash, and then things about the actual crash event itself. How many vehicles were involved, how many participants, what was the primary cause of crash. But then we can dig a little bit deeper. Now, generally because of funding constraints, we can't do this globally, but once we have an idea of the locations we're interested in, we do field visits, we do Google Maps, we start to understand what are the physical characteristics of the sites themselves. Now, as I said, CHP gathers this data. They have a database called SWITRs. That's pretty much, unless you're going back to the actual police reports, the raw data that we interact with. Now, there's a couple different databases which process this data further. Caltrans has their own database. UC Berkeley SafeTrack has developed TIMS at the request or with a contract with Caltrans to also develop it. And there's third-party programs that are used kind of nationwide, like Crossroads, which also does some processing of that data. But the important thing is that it all comes from the same source. Now, once again, that doesn't tell the whole story. You can dig a little bit deeper, going to the people who actually live and work in these communities, the staff and stakeholders. They can give a little more insight into where maybe there's facility gaps, where there's gaps in perceived safety that you wouldn't know of otherwise. And then there's even a development of new technology, which is allowing us to gather more insight into near misses. Near misses are a big piece of safety that we just don't have a lot of information about because they're never recorded, because the crashes never occur. So as we start to gain more information of that, it's really going to develop our understanding. Now, what do we do with that safety data? Well, there's a couple different project types. The first, and probably the most relevant to everyone here, or at least the people who work in safety, are really before-after studies. This is where we want to build our understanding of how different countermeasures affect safety. You know, if you add a protected left turn phase to a signal, what is that actually going to do to crash rates? There are studies of before and after something's implemented. You look at crash rates before and after. And those are the academic papers that come out of this. There's a great database called the Crash Modification Factor Clearinghouse, which is basically a culmination of just a very large number of studies where you can get specific data. I've just included an example here. Now, the other reason you might have before-after studies is more legislative or policy-based. Recently, I worked on a project where Caltrans required any automated red light enforcement on state roads to have this sort of understanding of what the effect of it is. Now, the primary cause of this is they want to make sure that agencies aren't using this just as a fundraising effort. Obviously, a lot of money comes from automated red light, and there's not a full consensus on what the effect of safety is. So things like that also lead to these studies. Now, more on the private side, you have land use and development based. This is usually based on the relationship between a city or a county and a developer that wants to add some sort of land use. Suddenly we're going to have a large influx of trip generation. We want to make sure that the roadway network around it stays safe. Now this may lead to signalization if there's increased demand. It may lead to pedestrian crossing enhancements, things of that sort. And a lot of times those are funded internally, either by the jurisdiction or by the developer themselves as part of the conditions of approval. Now, what I'm going to spend the rest of the time here talking about is the third type of study, which is how to prioritize investment. This is sort of a whole different animal because we're not looking at what the actual effective things are. We're looking into the past, saying where are our problem spots, and then saying we have a fixed amount of funding. We have a funding source that we want to use to fund safety improvements. But once again, we only have so much money, so where do we put those improvements? Where do we spend that money? Where do we invest? Generally, there's some sort of project evaluation involved here, whether benefit-cost ratio or otherwise. There are funding-based constraints for each funding program, which depend on the source of those funds, as well as general guidelines put together. Local Roadway Safety Manual is a common source for Caltrans-based funding programs. SafeTrack also had an initial input into that manual. And then finally, there's a difference between hotspot and systemic investment. And that's another thing I want to delve a little deeper into. So I'm going to jump back into one of these slides, methodology and definition. Let's make sure we understand the terms. So hotspot approach is the more traditional approach to safety, where we say, well, here's the location. It has a bunch of crashes. Let's figure out what happened here and what we can do to address it. That's how a lot of safety analysis has happened in the past. Now, over the past decade or so, we've started moving into a broader-based systemic approach to safety investment. Now, what this means is recognizing that crash events on the large scale are stochastic events. Given the amount of traffic we have, the amount of interactions we have all the time, they are actually pretty rare events, especially at the more severe levels. Now, systemic safety says, well, we don't want to react just to crashes that have happened. We want to recognize that just because a crash hasn't occurred doesn't mean it can't occur. And instead, we want to do broader-based, system-wide improvements that address a specific need that is observed in patterns of crashes. Now, when we dig into this analysis, severity comes out as one of the biggest funding analysis parameters. That is, when a crash occurs, is someone killed? Are they seriously injured? Are there possible injuries? Are there visible injuries? Or was it just a fender bender where you've got some property damage? And then one of the other analysis types we use is equivalent property damage only. Now, this comes from just a severe lack of data on volume across everywhere. Data is very expensive to gather. So if we can turn things from volume or rate-based into occurrence-based, that gives us a very powerful tool. So when we're calculating benefit-cost ratio, what we want to do is first calculate the benefit, which is the expected reduction in crashes we can expect from some countermeasure. On the other side of things, there's cost. Now, cost is pretty simple. What does it take to actually implement and then potentially maintain that improvement? Put them together, you get the benefit-cost ratio. Benefit is built on that KABCO, CABCO rating that I introduced last slide, where there is a societal cost developed by FHWA that says this is the cost of a fatality. This is the cost of a severe injury. Now, we put together the expected crash reduction from a countermeasure with the cost of the observed crash record, and we get our overall benefit. And then, of course, in the final column, the way we turn it into a weighted, a normalized value is by just kind of ranking everything in terms of property damage only. So you can see here that a fatality on a roadway, according to the local road safety manual, is 170 times as worse, or as bad as just some property damage.
Are you going to talk more about CMF?
CMF, yes. So, okay. So that goes back to actually this slide, which I probably didn't explain enough. The CMF is the crash modification factor. That is the studied effect of a countermeasure. So if a CMF is 70% after a countermeasure is installed, the expectation is that you would see only 70% of the crashes occur moving forward. There's also a parallel term called crash reduction factor, which would be 30%. They add up to 1. And these are where a lot of these before-after studies present a very wide range. It might be as very specific as only vehicle pedestrian crashes in urban environments on 2-lane arterials during the day. But it might be also very broad, all crashes, all environments. So this database breaks all that down, ranks each one, and then it's kind of up to us as the people dealing with it to decide which crash modification is the best to use in any given situation.
Do you consider it fairly reliable?
Yeah, I would say it's the source in terms of crash modification factors. Also helpful is that it really breaks down each level of trustworthiness and gives it a 5-star rating based on sample size, exhaustiveness, and all that. So it's a good source, and it kind of backs up its sources. So that's nice. Okay, so an example of hotspot approach would be where we've geographically mapped that weighted crash score based on severity. And then we say, well, there's a couple spots where we see that really severe crashes are occurring or a lot of crashes are occurring. Because of the weighting, either one of those is going to stand out to us. We zoom into that location, we do some diagnosing of it, we come up with appropriate countermeasures. Now, on the other side of it, we have the systemic approach. This is an example from a recent project I've done where we looked at all pedestrian crashes across Solano County for a 5-year period. We broke it down into intersections and non-intersections. Intersections we broke down into signalized and non-signalized. And now for each of these, we've got what are the main contributing factors with that weighted score in terms of severity. That means we can look and say, okay, well, at signalized intersections, the pedestrians are causing a lot of the problem. They're violating the right of way. They're walking when they shouldn't be walking, as opposed to stop signs, regulatory, where pedestrian right of way has been violated. And these are the terms that are in it, and they're not always clear, but there's documentation that breaks it down. And so we can compare those. We want two different types of mitigations for these locations. At a signalized intersection, knowing that pedestrians are violating the right of way of cars in this situation, we want to do something. You can't stop pedestrians from walking into the road, but what you can do is raise the visibility of the intersection so that cars speeding along say, oh, there's an intersection coming up, there might be a conflict, I should pay more attention. Whereas at the stop sign intersections where essentially pedestrians are walking when they should be walking, but they're still being hit, we can say, well, what we need to do, we can install an enhanced pedestrian crossing. Maybe it's an unmarked crossing, or maybe it's just a zebra stripe. Pedestrians think they're safe by crossing there, but the vehicles are just speeding through. There we might put up a beacon sign, something of that sort. So this gives us a little more insight. Now this is county-wide, so we say, well, let's find the locations where the most pedestrian crossings are happen, and just install these beacon crossings system-wide. So that'll be more of a systemic approach, relatively low cost, relatively high benefit. Okay, now that we've got all of our terms and definitions and concepts out of the way, let's dig a little bit into the funding process. So there's a federal program called the Highway Safety Improvement Program, or HSIP, as I'm going to refer to it throughout the rest of this presentation. It was originally funded back in 2005 and updated and further funded in 2012 and 2015 through the MAP and FAST Acts. Maybe you've heard of some of these. The focus on this is really providing data-driven strategic approach to safety improvements. And there's four components of it at the federal level. There is the Strategic Highway Safety Plan, which each state is required to build. There are individual state HSIP funding programs, and then more focused programs for railway crossings and high-risk rural roads. Now, as part of this program, FHWA requires each state to evaluate the success of their program as part of the funding requirements. Now, they're not required to look at they're not required to provide localized safety impacts, but that's usually part of the whole analysis. And then there's also the economic measures. Is funding being spent in a decent return on investment? That's where we're looking at that benefit-cost ratio. Usually at this level, it's statewide and not project-specific. Now, with both of these, there's potential source of bias, and this is actually throughout safety research. The biggest one is essentially short-term data analysis can lead to very skewed results. And that is kind of demonstrated right here. Is if you took, say, a 10, 12-year average of safety, you might get a very different average rate than if you, say, looked at those 4 years or those 4 years. Now, this represents a location where maybe nothing has been done, and yet you'd see this jump in crashes that occurred. Now, generally, investment is focused in places where a lot of crashes occur, because that kind of draws the attention both of the public, of staff. Now, if you imagine that graph in reverse, you might see that without any improvement, you'd see a drop in crash rates. Now imagine that combined with safety improvement. And we say, hey, we made a big difference. We dropped all these crashes. When actually it's really just a statistical fluctuation. So that's one of the things that is taken care of at the more academic level and isn't as often done on the funding or consultant level. But it's important for people like me to recognize that this is a thing as we're moving forward with these funding sources. Okay, so now the method of distribution for this federal money is really left up to each state individually. And even just working in California, Oregon, and Washington, they all have very different means and requirements and guidelines for how they distribute it. I'm going to focus on California because here we are, this is where I work. Caltrans has implemented 9 cycles of HSIP funding now. And it's a continually evolving program, which really makes it difficult to have any consistent basis for evaluating the success of the program, because the program itself keeps changing year by year. Now, the evolution of the program has, I think, generally improved in terms of both reach, in terms of methodology. In cycle 4, they started with specifically looking at benefit cost ratio. In cycle 5, that's when they contracted with UC Berkeley to develop the TIMS tool to provide a consistent basis of comparison. Cycle 6 and cycle 7, they messed with how much funding they handed out per cycle. And it was really cycle 8 back in 2016 that they really started getting robust in their methodology. They developed an internal tool that they developed in combination with their guidelines. They introduced set-aside funding, which is a little bit of a reverse from the BC ratio. They said, well, no, you don't have to show your BC anymore, but we're attributing a certain amount of money towards specific improvements. That first cycle, it was guardrails and pedestrian crossing enhancements. When they moved over to cycle 9, they increased that to 5 categories. And I think the benefit of this is to encourage more systemic investment by saying if you're increasing, say, guardrails or pedestrian crossings across a large area without having to provide that BC ratio, that recognizes that, once again, if you improve locations that don't have crashes, you're still having a positive effect on safety. Also, what happened last cycle was the introduction of a support grant system. It's kind of interesting because it's a grant program to encourage jurisdictions to then apply for a grant later on. So it takes a little bit of self-motivation to do it. And that's what I want to dig into a little bit right now, because I was involved significantly in both working with the SSARP, which is the Systemic Safety Analysis Reporting Program, as well as the HIP for this last cycle. When we look at the requirements for evaluation of these programs, well, safety projects are occurring, so you'd assume that safety is improving across the state, so check there. Economically, they're using benefit cost ratio to evaluate and fund these programs, so economically, hopefully we're doing great. The question is, how effective are they at actually distributing these funds? California is a very large, very diverse state, and the question is, you've got a set amount of funding, how exactly are you handing this out? The whole reason they introduced the SSARP in the first place is that the same jurisdictions were applying for the funding. A lot of jurisdictions didn't have the resources or the expertise to use these funds, and that was being recognized year after year. So, the goal of this program was to help local agencies apply for HIP funding. I think it's important to recognize the wording of that, to apply for funding, not to get funding, and that's going to become really important in a little bit. Now, the timing of this, it was introduced in 2016. They had 36 months to use the funding, which is essentially HIP cycle 9, but maybe a little into cycle 10. And 17 million went out to 106 different agencies. Now, this was 100% funding. They funded every single agency that asked for funding, regardless of the quality of their application. Now, the original call was only for 10 million. They actually went back, found another 7 million to then fund the remaining. Here's the thing though, only of that 106 agencies, only 48 of them received funding in cycle 9 HIP. That's a really low, that's less than 50%. So if the goal is to help local agencies identify or to apply for funding, but then a lot of that funding doesn't get distributed, well, that speaks to maybe the effectiveness of this program. So the question, was it successful? Well, big picture, once again, less than half the agencies that got support funding ended up with any safety funding. The call size, the stated amount that they were going to hand out for cycle 8 and cycle 9 was both 150 million. As you can see from this graph, the yellow line represents how much money was distributed. 216 million went out in cycle 8. After the SSARP program happened, only about 180 went out in cycle 9. So after this investment, to help agencies apply for funding, they actually handed out 16% less funding. So, but 40% more applications were submitted. You can see the spike in the dark green line. Agency was like, hey, this is awesome. We're getting help. We can apply for this funding. But then this happened. So, additionally, the yellow line's going up and up and up. And yet, this last cycle, less money is distributed. Now, I do want to caveat the rest of this that I asked for more information from Caltrans, and they declined to give it to me. So I'm working with publicly available information. It gave me a lot of information, but I'm missing a lot of things like what the relevant BC ratios were, how many jurisdictions actually submitted applications versus how many were awarded. But I think we've got a really telling story here. So the other thing that I noticed is that there's a bit of a trend in terms of how many applications were submitted. Back in cycle 4, when they started with the benefit cost ratio, almost 700 applications were submitted. Now, only about 24% of them were funded. Now, what happens in cycle 5? There's a significant drop-off of applications, but that's to be expected. You put this time, you put this effort into asking for money, you don't get any. Well, maybe you don't do that next time. Now, after there was a higher rate of success in cycle 5 and some changes to the program, well, it upticked again. But then suddenly only 2/3 of the applications were funded, and we see another drop-off. Now, between cycle 7 and 8, we kind of go apace, and then with the introduction of the SSARP, we see another uptick in applications, but without a similar uptick in awarded projects. So my expectation, we don't know yet, but my expectation is that we're going to see, unfortunately, another drop-off in applications. So the other question becomes, once again, how successful was this program? Now let's focus in a little more from that big picture. What are some questions? Did support funding increase the funded project size? Well, yeah, it did. There was the same number of projects funded. Go back. The awarded, yes. So there was less projects awarded, more submitted. Oh, that's what it is, sorry. When you control for agencies that specifically had support, the size of the projects for those agencies were bigger, by almost twice as much. I think the average application for an agency without support was 800,000. The average one with SSARP support was 1.8 million. So we do see larger projects are being funded. Now, but did having support funding improve application success? Well, yes, again. If you look at the first column for agencies that didn't have support funding to the second column, we see an increase in the amount of money that was distributed. So at least it seems to have given a bigger pot to people that had the funding. Here's the other side, though. How much of the increase was due to just having experience in applying for this grant application? Well, if you look at the first row versus the second row, there's almost 156% increase in funding given to agencies that had previously applied versus ones that were new to the game. Way bigger effect than the one of the funding. In fact, if you compare new agencies with SSARP funding, it's less money than agencies that had previously applied that did not have funding. So we can see very clearly that experience counts for way more than this support did. Once again, not necessarily a positive result for this program. Okay. Now, digging in, one of the focuses, it's even in the name from this program, was to look for more systemic improvements, adding more projects into the pot with a higher efficiency of improvement. You want low-cost, widespread improvements. Unfortunately, the constraints of the funding program itself didn't really lead itself to that. There's only specific countermeasures that were allowed to be funded. The other part of it was they said to apply for this funding, you only need a 3.5 benefit cost ratio. Now in cycle 8, a 3.5 was perfectly fine to be funded. This cycle goes to 7.2. So the BC ratio cutoff almost doubled. Actually more than doubled. Now just as an example, as a consultant helping an agency, you're essentially asking them to gamble with millions of dollars in funding to have a better effect on safety. This was a table I prepared for one of the agencies I was working with. In the first column is the benefit cost ratio for individual projects, but by putting them together, we can essentially take advantage of higher BC ratio projects to fund lower BC ratio projects. But of course, that cumulative BCR, the one that's part of the application, is going to decrease as you add more and more projects. Originally, and I told them we want to cut off at 6.0. That would fund 5 different projects at $250,000 each. Now, what actually happened was we revisited, I kind of analyzed, the cost went up, and I was like, you know what, I want to stay above 8. But just one single project being added to that application would have meant it wasn't funded. That happened to a lot of agencies across this grant call. So, from my perspective, having been through both of these, what have we learned? What's some of the lessons I'm taking away? Well, number one, a lot of the issues, even when we were just marketing out our services for this project, came from lack of communication or staff turnover with the agencies. Sometimes the people that applied for the grant funding were not the people who would then implement it. So we'd give them a call and say, hey, you've got this money, we'd love to help you out. And they said, what money? That's not a good sign. A lot of jurisdictions went in with kind of separate goals. They wanted to get a lot of data collection. They wanted to check METCD compliance across their board. The safety wasn't really the main focus. Finally, there was no correlation between size of agency and the amount of funding they got from this program. One of the projects I applied for it was a county-wide project, $450,000, or no, 450,000 people. They got $500,000. There's another project, I don't know if anyone knows, the town of Colma. It only has 1,000 residents. It got $300,000. So there was very little connection between, you can see right at that low population, the spread of grants awarded. So it really comes down to why weren't these SSARP-funded agencies successful in obtaining funding? Well, number one, a lot of them just didn't know they had funding or what to do with it. Number two, that focus on systemic projects led to lower BC ratios for some agencies, which dropped below the cutoff region. They were essentially gambling with how much money they could get. And then there was another group that just sat on it, didn't know what to do with it, maybe looking at cycle 10, but they haven't even gotten around to applying for funding. So I think that the lack of resources and the expertise, the very issues that this grant program was supposed to address, are the ones that really built up the barriers or the challenges to successful implementation. Now, we can end on a positive note. One of the agencies I work with, Solano Transportation Authority, it's the congestion management agency for Solano County, and its member agencies are the 7 cities and the unincorporated county throughout the region. As I said, population of 450,000. Now, previously, individual cities had applied for funding, got it, but there was never really any county-wide concerted effort. Now, why were they successful? The person who applied for the funding was very knowledgeable about the topic and was also the person who implemented the funding. So we had that consistency of knowledge. They were actually the first to begin the SSARP effort, the first to submit an RFP for the program. They were able to combine that effort across agencies with sort of an umbrella element of a single project manager, both on the client side and on the consultant side, so that even if there was staff turnover, which there was, a single person or a couple people were able to balance that. They applied for the maximum amount of funding.
Oh, no, please.
Okay. And they were really focused on the safety effort. They got a travel safety plan out of it, a regional long-term plan of improvements, and then they also went forward and got 3.4 times any previous funding they had gotten, almost $9 million. Finally, they had a consultant who collaborated, built trust with both the agency themselves and the individual cities. And I think that was ultimately what led to their success. So, with that, I'll open it up to questions. And
the way you presented regarding the cutoff of the cost-benefit ratio, was that the primary criteria that Caltrans uses to rank the projects and decide which to fund?
that was the only criteria. If there weren't any fatal flaws in the application, they were ranked by BC, and whenever they decided that was enough funding, that's where they cut it off.
And did they have a minimum, a maximum funding
Yes.
support?
So the maximum funding per agency was $10 million, and the minimum size per application was $100,000. So there was kind of like, and that's per agency and per application.
Yeah, Roger, another thing that's creeping on autonomous vehicles, because there is a way of approaching safety with greater use of autonomous vehicles. But I've read in the papers that the Teslas have been able to drive their owners home safely. And also you can stop a Tesla by getting in front of it.
Yeah.
So that's a very interesting development.
No, absolutely. The automated vehicles get, they're going up against a pretty tough audience because we're used to car crashes. Like, they happen all the time. But we have control over that. Maybe that's a good thing, maybe that's a bad thing. But ultimately, when a crash happens, and once again, I talked about this at the beginning, it's an unknown factor, right? The cop comes, you give your story, someone else gives their story. We all know memory is extremely fallible, especially in extreme circumstances. When a Tesla gets into a crash, we have video of the entire event. We have the literal routines that were going through the software as they led to the event. We can see what it saw, both visible and invisible, and we can say, that was the problem. And I think that knowledge right now is dangerous. I don't know if that's the right word, but because we can exactly put blame, it makes it very easy to demonize the technology. And the public can turn on technology very quickly. A couple of pedestrians die from automated vehicles, and that becomes a very dangerous thing when pedestrians die from human-driven vehicles all the time, constantly. Now, it is a very complex problem. It's being worked on by different people in different directions, and we have a very much of a hodgepodge. So there's no simple answer, but I think that overall it will definitely improve safety. And we are seeing those. You kind of see the news stories about the fatalities that happen. But I encourage you to go on YouTube and look up videos of where an automated car actually prevented a crash. There's a couple out there, and they're pretty powerful.
So I know you didn't really talk about cycling at all.
Sure.
And that's a huge safety aspect, talking about pedestrians. And I was curious to what extent cycling makes its way through the funding stream, if at all. Especially since, and you can also your thoughts on the fact that a lot of cycling-related crashes or near misses are almost never reported by anyone,
Right.
including the cyclist. So I want the fact that it's not included in that. What are your thoughts?
Sure. So the first part of it is dealing with do they make it through the system? Well, number one, when they're reported, yes, they absolutely do. The safety data, the crash data, does have categories for bicycle involved, for pedestrian involved. We're dealing with separate facilities, even though there are absolutely points of conflict. There are specific improvements which are tied to pedestrians or bicyclists. So we know if we see an occurrence of these types of crashes, those are the mitigations we go to. And some of them are literally only providing crash modification factors for bicycle-involved crashes. So that affects the benefit-cost ratio appropriately. The other thing about it is those crashes tend to amplify their effect because we see some of the most severe crashes when pedestrians or bicyclists are involved because of the lack of protection for the user. So because of that weighting system, those more severe crashes are going to rise to the top. Now, what you said about unreported crashes, that's a huge issue because it becomes invisible to us, right? So I'm working on an active transportation plan right now in Solano County. And part of what we did was pop-up events, community outreach at locations where citizens already are. We found that that's the best way to do outreach. Instead of saying, hey, come to us, tell us what you think. No, we're going to come to you. You get a lot more truthful, you get a broader base. And that's where that whole stakeholder community information comes into play. Because there doesn't have to be a recorded crash for people to know that a location's unsafe. And so when people are willing to come forth and talk about their experiences, mark on a map, provide input, that's where we learn about these things. And maybe it's not the direct funding source because it doesn't have that BC ratio, but these broader systemic-based improvements are exactly what helps solve this. You know, if we have improved crossings, if we can install bicycle lanes along a broader corridor, because of a couple locations where there were severe crashes or fatalities, that can help fund improvements across a much broader range of locations. So even though it's tough to get the data, and if we had more data, we can fund more things, but it doesn't mean that those are completely ignored.
Do you have any opinions on where to collect or how to collect that data?
Well, exactly what I said.
People beyond like actually reporting though, like is there like a mechanism that you would suggest?
It's just,
Beyond-
it's outreach. It's talking to staff and people who bike, talking to bicycle coalitions and saying, where isn't it safe? But outside of talking to the people and seeing recorded crashes, then it's really up to kind of finding a needle in a haystack, hoping that people are using the existing facilities, because there are safe places to bike, or at least safer places to bike, but not everyone pays attention to that. But it's also raising education awareness. There's always controversy about bicyclists ignoring stop signs, biking the wrong way down the road, which is actually a significant portion of crashes, and that's behavioral. You know, we could add improvements that help, but when it comes down to individual behavior, there's only so much we can do.
So I want to get back to the funding issues that you were bringing up.
Yeah.
And I want to, because the more I hear about it, the more it sounds like the wild, wild west. It seems very crazy to me. So do you think that this money for safety improvement in California, do you think that it's distributed effectively or fairly? Are there other ways to improve it? But why don't we start with the
So there's a couple ways to improve it, and we know this because different states do it differently. Now, we're not dealing with the same demographic or the same size or complexity of California, but just for example, Oregon, the way they distribute improvements is they actually 50% for systemic improvements and 50% for hotspot improvements. So those projects are not competing against each other. They're competing internally. So that can have a big effect. In Washington, their cycles go back and forth. One year they'll fund county improvements, generally unincorporated improvements. The next year they'll fund city improvements. Now, what I've noticed is that they aren't equal. This type of benefit cost funding benefits rural areas because they tend to have lower cost improvements and higher severity crashes. That's where you're going to have the off-road flipping on a too tight of a curve, too high of a speed, whereas more urban areas, you're going to have a lot more conflict points between pedestrians and cars. You're already going to have more of a built-up environment because a lot of investment's already been put into the city. And so it's a completely different, you're comparing apples and oranges. But if they're on the same evaluation playing field, you're going to see, and once again, I've talked to clients that they have the same complaint. The funding is going to go towards those higher BCs first. Someplace you just can't get a high BC.
So, in the context of the funding cycle that came after SSARP, so were they a combination of spot and systemic improvements? Were they only systemic, or?
They're both.
So then, considering that, the BC ratio is higher, so I guess one question is, how? So one would would BC ratios for systemic projects be by definition lower because I guess we're making the cost scales up. Let's assume it's a unit
So ideally, no. And I've talked to colleagues in different states where ideally systemic improvements should have some of the highest BC ratios because they're supposed to be low-cost, effective improvements. You know, if you can do signage, improve signage across 50% of your city, you're going to hit high crash locations and low crashes occasions, and it's a relatively low cost, and it's gonna balance out. If you have, you know, shoulder milling, things like that, ideal systemic improvements are supposed to be low cost. The issue with how it's implemented with this system is that we have to pick from a discrete list of countermeasures that we can pick from. And they have that minimum funding threshold. So those two together leads to situations like I had where I was trying to implement systemic improvements at $250,000 a pop, where that BC ratio starts dropping pretty quickly, even though you're trying to implement this sort of broader-based, trend-based improvement. So once again, implemented correctly, or even with separate funding sources, it might work out better than throwing everything together in one pot.
So, if I understand correctly, so you have multiple different agencies submitting their reports, and a lot of reward is based off of these BC ratio thresholds. Presuming that there's a very high incentive to want to kind of inflate those BC ratios a little bit, what kind of safeguards are there, to your best of your knowledge, to like try to combat that?
So essentially the safeguard is everyone's working with the same analysis tool. It is an internally provided, at this point it's a PDF that's form fillable that does all the calculations itself. So you insert the crashes, you insert the improvement, it calculates the benefit for you. And those crashes have to be supported by crash diagrams, crash records, so you can't invent crashes. And on the cost side, you'd only be able to increase it by decreasing your costs, but at the same time, this is the actual funding needed to implement it. So agencies don't really have an incentive to decrease the reported cost, or they're going to end up funding it themselves. So from that standpoint, it does a fine job. There's an even playing field. So there's it would be difficult to sort of cheat the system to any real benefit.
So that's a little more focused on like hotspot related instead, right? It's sort of like your inputting crashes, like how do you say like if we improve this like stretch of road that nothing's ever happened on, how do you come up with that number? What's the expected crash reduction rate?
Well, that's the issue. The issue is that the funding comes from observed crashes. And so as you start including locations that don't have crashes or have low rate of crashes, your BC is going to drop. And so that's where that gamble comes in. Do I add one or two more locations, but now maybe not get funding? So see people looking at their watches. I think we're right at 5 o'clock. But I will be available afterwards to answer any other questions people have. But thank you very much.
On behalf of Translog and ITS Berkeley, we want to give you an ITS branded water bottle.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for coming.